There's a version of New York City that no longer exists. Not in the buildings. Not in the streets. Not even in the memories of anyone alive today. If you were to walk those same Manhattan blocks now, past the glass towers and the endless traffic, you would find it nearly impossible to imagine what stood there before. But for a moment tonight, I'd like to take you back. Back to a time when New York was not yet the center of the world, but was becoming it. A time of gaslight and cobblestone. Of immigrants and industry. Of both remarkable progress and profound struggle. The 1800s shaped this city in ways that still echo through every corner of modern New York. And tonight, we'll walk through it together, slowly, carefully, as if we ourselves had just arrived on those crowded shores. This video has been produced with the assistance of artificial intelligence and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. All historical information has been drawn from documented sources and period accounts. What I'm about to share with you comes from a careful reading of the historical record. From city directories and census documents. From letters written by those who lived through these decades. From newspaper archives, ship manifests, and the observations of visitors who chronicled what they saw. Historians generally agree on the broad strokes of New York's transformation during the 19th century. But the texture of daily life, the small human details, often get lost in the larger narrative of progress and expansion. I've tried to bring some of those details back. Because understanding the 1800s isn't just about knowing dates and population figures. It's about understanding how ordinary people navigated extraordinary change. How they built their lives in a city that was constantly rebuilding itself around them. We'll move through this chronologically, but not rigidly. History doesn't unfold in neat chapters, and neither will this exploration. Instead, think of this as a series of windows, each one offering a different view into the life of the city during different moments across that remarkable century. By the end, I hope you'll have a sense not just of what New York looked like in the 1800s, but what it felt like. What it sounded like. What challenges its people faced, and what dreams they carried with them through those crowded, chaotic, hopeful streets. So let us begin at the beginning. In the year 1800, New York City was home to approximately 60,000 souls. That may sound substantial, but remember, this entire population lived almost exclusively on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Everything north of what we now call Houston Street was largely farmland, estates, and wilderness. The city ended where the city began, at the waterfront. The street grid we know today, that orderly procession of numbered avenues and streets, did not yet exist. The streets of early 1800s New York followed old cow paths and property lines. They curved and dead-ended and changed names without warning. Most buildings were wood. Fire was a constant threat, and volunteer fire companies, often associated with particular neighborhoods or political factions, responded as much out of civic rivalry as civic duty. The port was everything. Ships arrived daily from Europe, from the Caribbean, from ports along the Atlantic coast. They brought goods, news, and people. New York's harbor was already recognized as one of the finest natural ports in the world, and the city's merchants were beginning to understand the wealth that geography had granted them. Yellow fever epidemics swept through periodically, driving those who could afford it to flee to Greenwich Village or further north, to the clearer air beyond the dense waterfront blocks. But here's what's worth considering. How does a city of 60,000, pleasant enough, prosperous enough, but hardly dominant, transform itself into the undisputed center of American commerce and culture within just a few decades? The answer lies partly in a ditch. In 1817, the state of New York began construction on the Erie Canal, a man-made waterway that would eventually connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and thereby to the entire Great Lakes region and the expanding western frontier. When it opened in 1825, the Erie Canal fundamentally altered the economic geography of North America. Suddenly, goods from the interior, grain, timber, furs, could flow to New York cheaply and efficiently. And manufactured goods from Europe and the eastern seaboard could flow back. New York became the hinge between the Atlantic world and the American interior. Other cities had tried to build similar canals. But New York succeeded first and most completely. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. To understand the next phase of New York's story, we need to travel across the ocean. Because in the 1840s, disaster struck Ireland. The Irish potato famine, which began in 1845, forced millions to flee starvation. Many of them came to New York. They arrived weak, often ill, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. At the same time, political upheaval in Germany sent waves of German immigrants across the Atlantic. Failed revolutions, economic hardship, and the promise of land and opportunity in America drew them westward, and most passed through New York. By 1860, nearly half of New York's population was foreign-born. The city had become a polyglot metropolis almost overnight. The older Anglo-Dutch establishment found itself suddenly outnumbered. Tensions rose, over jobs, over housing, over religion, over politics. Most of these new arrivals could not afford the genteel townhouses that lined Broadway or the developing neighborhoods to the north. Instead, they crowded into tenements, hastily constructed buildings designed to pack as many families as possible into the smallest possible space. A typical tenement apartment might consist of 3 rooms, a front room with windows facing the street, a middle room with no windows at all, and a back room overlooking a narrow air shaft. An entire family, sometimes multiple families, would share these rooms. Sanitation was primitive. Outdoor privies shared among dozens of residents. Water from public pumps, often contaminated. Disease spread easily in such conditions: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. And yet, life went on. Immigrant neighborhoods developed their own rhythms, their own institutions. Churches and synagogues. Mutual aid societies. Newspapers in German, in Yiddish, in Italian. The city was becoming not just larger, but more complex. A tapestry of cultures living side by side, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in surprising cooperation. This raises an important question: what does it mean to be a New Yorker when the city is changing so rapidly that no single culture, no single language, no single way of life dominates? The answer, it seems, was perpetual reinvention. New York in the 1800s developed a particular character: restless, pragmatic, forward-looking. If you could work, if you could adapt, if you could survive, you belonged. It was a harsh standard. But it was also, in its way, more open than the rigid social hierarchies of Europe. The city's economy absorbed this labor. Factories, workshops, construction sites, all needed workers. The garment industry, in particular, grew rapidly. Small shops where immigrant women sewed clothing for piece rates. The work was grueling, the pay meager, but it was work. Men found employment on the docks, in shipbuilding, in the building trades. The city was expanding physically at an extraordinary rate, and every new building, every new street, required labor. Yet it's important to note, this was not an age of worker protections or labor rights. Hours were long, 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Workplace accidents were common and compensation rare. Child labor was routine. The wealth being generated in New York during these decades was immense. But it was not evenly distributed. Many of you may have ancestors who passed through New York during this period. Perhaps they stayed. Perhaps they moved on, to the Midwest, to the mining towns, to wherever opportunity beckoned. Either way, their experience was likely defined by this same tension between hope and hardship, between the promise of America and the daily struggle to survive in a city that cared little for individual suffering. And yet they persevered. The fact that we are here, discussing their world, is testament to that perseverance. In 1811, long before most of Manhattan was developed, city planners made a decision that would define New York's appearance forever. They imposed a grid. The commissioner's plan laid out numbered streets running east-west and numbered avenues running north-south across the entire island. It was rational, orderly, and completely ignored the natural topography. Hills were leveled. Streams were buried. The irregular, organic street pattern of old New York was to be replaced by this rigorous geometry. At the time, much of this grid existed only on paper, lines drawn across farmland and forest. But as the city grew northward throughout the 19th century, the grid became real. Block by block, decade by decade. This transformation came at a cost. Early visitors to Manhattan often remarked on its natural beauty: the rolling hills, the forests, the streams, and ponds. Much of this was erased. One notable exception, Central Park. Designated in 1853 and designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vose, Central Park represented a deliberate effort to preserve green space within the expanding city. Its creation acknowledged something important, that human beings need nature, need places of respite, even, perhaps especially, in dense urban environments. The park's construction was itself a massive undertaking. Entire hills were moved. Lakes were dug. Thousands of workers, many of them Irish immigrants, transformed what had been rocky, swampy terrain into carefully designed pastoral landscapes. The 1800s also saw remarkable innovations in urban infrastructure. Gas lighting arrived in the 1820s, gradually replacing oil lamps and transforming the nighttime city. By mid-century, some streets were lit well enough that evening commerce and entertainment became practical. The Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, brought clean water from upstate reservoirs to Manhattan, a monumental engineering achievement that immediately improved public health. Before this, New Yorkers had relied on local wells and pumps, many contaminated. Horse-drawn streetcars appeared in the 1830s, running on rails embedded in the streets. These made it possible for middle-class New Yorkers to live further from their workplaces, accelerating the northward expansion of residential neighborhoods. And toward the end of the century, elevated railways, steam-powered trains running on tracks above the streets, began operation. They were noisy, dirty, and transformative. Suddenly, Harlem and the Bronx were within commuting distance of Lower Manhattan. But this raises a question worth considering: was all this change progress? Certainly, many contemporaries thought so. They marveled at the gas lights, the aqueduct, the speed of development. New York was becoming modern, becoming great. Yet others mourned what was lost. The natural landscapes. The quieter pace of life. The sense of community that came from smaller, more stable neighborhoods. Perhaps both perspectives have merit. Progress rarely comes without cost, and the New York of the 1800s was nothing if not a study in trade-offs. By mid-century, the tension simmering within New York's rapidly changing society began to boil over. The city was deeply divided, by class, by ethnicity, by race, by competing visions of what America should be. In July of 1863, New York erupted in violence. The immediate cause was the draft. The Union Army, desperately needing soldiers for the Civil War, had instituted a conscription system. But the system was profoundly unjust. Wealthy men could pay $300 to hire a substitute, effectively buying their way out of service. Poor men, in many of them recent Irish immigrants, could not. The resentment this caused ignited into 4 days of rioting. What began as protest against the draft quickly became something uglier. Mobs attacked African Americans, blaming them for the war. The colored orphan asylum was burned. Black New Yorkers were beaten, murdered, driven from their homes. Federal troops, fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg, were called in to restore order. By the time the violence subsided, over 100 people were dead, making it one of the deadliest riots in American history. To understand these events, we need to recognize the complicated position of Irish immigrants in 1860s New York. They were among the poorest, most marginalized groups in the city. They competed with free black New Yorkers for the lowest-paying jobs. Many feared that if slavery ended, the influx of freed people moving north would drive wages down even further. This economic anxiety, combined with racial prejudice and resentment toward the Republican establishment, created a volatile mixture. The draft was simply the spark. None of this excuses the violence, particularly the racist brutality directed at black New Yorkers. But it helps explain the context in which it occurred. History is rarely simple, and the people who lived through it were responding to pressures and fears that felt, to them, overwhelming. The Civil War era revealed deep fractures in New York society. The city was nominally part of the Union, but many of its residents, particularly Irish and working-class Democrats, opposed the war or at least opposed how it was being fought. Meanwhile, black New Yorkers, despite facing discrimination and violence, contributed to the Union cause. Regiments of black soldiers were raised, though they had to train outside the city due to local hostility. The wealthy classes, largely insulated from both the draft and the riots, continued to build their mansions along Fifth Avenue and accumulate fortunes from war contracts and industrial expansion. What strikes me, looking back at this period, is the sheer difficulty of holding a diverse city together during a time of national crisis. New York in the 1860s contained multitudes. People with different backgrounds, different interests, different visions of justice. Making such a place function required constant negotiation, and sometimes, tragically, the negotiations failed. Yet the city survived. It absorbed the shock of the draft riots, mourned its dead, and continued growing. This resilience, this capacity to endure crisis and keep moving forward, became part of New York's identity. As we move into the final decades of the 19th century, we encounter a New York of startling contrasts. Immense wealth and desperate poverty. Technological marvels and grinding labor. Architectural grandeur and crumbling slums. This was the Gilded Age, gilded because beneath the bright surface, much was tarnished. This was the era of Vanderbilt, of Astor, of Morgan. Men who built vast fortunes in railroads, real estate, and finance. Their wealth was almost incomprehensible by the standards of the time. They built mansions that occupied entire city blocks. They collected art from Europe. They established the institutions, museums, libraries, concert halls that still define New York's cultural landscape. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, founded in 1870. The American Museum of Natural History, opened in 1869. Carnegie Hall, which opened in 1891. These were gifts to the city, certainly. But they were also monuments to the donor's wealth and taste. But as the wealthy built upward and outward, the poor remained trapped in conditions that shocked even hardened observers. Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant who became a pioneering photojournalist, documented tenement life in his 1890 book How the Other Half Lives. His photographs showed families crowded into dark, airless rooms. Children sleeping on sidewalks. Sweatshop where people worked themselves to exhaustion for pennies. Riis's work helped spark the first serious housing reform efforts. But change came slowly. The forces of the market, landlords seeking profit, employers seeking cheap labor, were powerful, and reformers faced an uphill battle. The flow of immigrants continued, but now from different places. By the 1880s and 1890s, increasing numbers arrived from southern and eastern Europe, Italians, Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland, Greeks, Poles. Each group established its own neighborhood, its own institutions. Little Italy, the Lower East Side's Jewish quarter. These areas were crowded and poor, but they were also vibrant, full of street vendors, small shops, synagogues and churches, mutual aid societies. Ellis Island opened in 1892 as the primary immigration processing center. Millions would pass through it in the coming decades, and for many, their first glimpse of America was the New York skyline rising across the harbor. The late 1800s brought innovations that changed daily life. The telephone arrived in the 1870s. Electric lighting began replacing gas in the 1880s. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, was an engineering marvel that linked Brooklyn to Manhattan, a symbol of what human ingenuity could achieve. And toward the very end of the century, a new kind of building appeared, the skyscraper. Made possible by steel frame construction and the invention of the electric elevator, these tall buildings pointed toward the 20th century city that was coming. The New York of 1900 was vastly different from the New York of 1800. In population, in physical extent, in economic power, in cultural influence, every measure showed explosive growth. The small port town had become a metropolis of 3.5 million people, the second largest city in the world. But perhaps the deeper transformation was in character. New York had become a place defined by change itself. A city that constantly reinvented itself, that absorbed wave after wave of newcomers, that tore down and built up with equal enthusiasm. This could be exhilarating. It could also be exhausting, disorienting, even cruel. But it was undeniably dynamic. If you found value in this exploration of 19th century New York, if you appreciate documentaries that take time to develop their subjects thoughtfully, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel. I create these videos because I believe history deserves careful attention. Not sensationalism, not shortcuts, but genuine engagement with the past and the people who lived it. Your comments and insights are always welcome. I read them, and I often learn from them. Until next time, thank you for your time and attention.